An appeals court today rebuked the administration in the case of the mistakenly deported man, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, that we've been covering. The administration has been accused of basically flouting the order to facilitate his return. There's been a lot of debate over what that word will now require, and the judge says it's difficult in some cases to get to the very heart of the matter. But in this case, it's not hard at all, saying that Trump administration lawyers are asserting a right to stash away residents of this country, America, in foreign prisons without the semblance of due process that is the foundation of our constitutional order. Those are strong words and, if you're keeping track, stronger than the way Chief Justice Roberts put it in the unanimous opinion that did rule against Trump but has yet to result in the return of this individual, to effectuate the result, as lawyers have said. But this is still early days for this clash. Senator Chris Van Hollen from Maryland went to El Salvador over this issue, saying that he has his own standing in the co-equal branch of government because this is a constituent. And he states that despite making that full trip, he was denied entry into the prison where he wanted to inspect and work on this issue in order to check on, at the minimum, the presence and welfare of Mr. Garcia.
Our goal was very simple today, which was to check on the health and well-being of Kilmar. We were stopped by soldiers at a checkpoint. We were told by the soldiers that they'd been ordered not to allow us to proceed any further. I do intend to keep at this until we ensure that Mr. Abrego Garcia has his rights to due process.
Remember, that is due process that has been denied. The Supreme Court saying not only was it the mistake that the Trump administration admits, but the individual should be returned. And as I've told you, if they get away with this, and that can happen to that individual, it can happen to others. And if an American says, hey, I'm an American, I shouldn't be rotting away in a foreign prison, well, who would they be saying that to if due process is destroyed and they get away with it? That's why the stakes are high on this issue. The district judge indicates she may hold the government in some type of contempt. And the judge overseeing a related case on the wartime powers here also alluding to contempt over the defiance that those officials turn around the original flight to El Salvador. All of this is about power. Can Donald Trump seize wartime powers when there is no declared war against El Salvador or this gang? A judge is also weighing if the government should be forced to give notice to people that it would ever deport in this manner, since this is clearly on the table. And plaintiffs' lawyers noting the last time this act was even invoked, it was World War II, and those deemed to be dangerous to the public during a world war had a month's notice before they could be removed. So if you're watching and thinking, well, we got to be tough on immigration, or you have a person who's more sympathetic to Trump and MAGA and says, hey, it's time for tough measures, the lawyer's pointing out there, we're not even at the World War II level due process. And I don't think anyone can seriously say that these threats, which are, of course, real to people, we have gangs and other violence in this country, I don't think anyone can seriously claim they're at the level of Germany and Japan in World War II. As for Trump's so-called retribution tour, administration is going after these schools we've told you about, including Harvard, because they won't buckle to a big government shakedown. And Trump is hitting back in ways that may or may not be legal. A lot of this is being tested, but trying to seize and freeze over $2 billion of what was already authorized funding for Harvard. And some of that money goes to things everybody wants, like solving Alzheimer's. The Post reports that the government also had no proof of any specific laws broken by Harvard in the review of the documents they did. But the Trump administration now says it will ask the IRS to punish Harvard in what sounds like a political manner. So this probably shouldn't work if there's a factual process, but they want to take away the very valuable tax-exempt status because Harvard is not some for-profit company. It's tax-exempt like universities and houses of worship often are. DHS also threatening to revoke Harvard's eligibility to admit foreign students, saying that's something they could try to yank. The state's Democratic governor, Maura Healey, spoke to us about all of this.
That this is really just another attempt by Donald Trump to silence those who disagree with him, to bully, in this case, our colleges and universities. It's an abuse of power. It smacks of the authoritarian regimes of past when you talk about silencing law firms, companies, colleges, and universities.
He mentions law firms. The top firms are a huge target, and some have already buckled under the pressure. They represent all kinds of individuals. The New York Times reporting that the firms who agreed to work with the administration thought they could cut some kind of deal, but Trump, even on the deal they cut, wants to move the goalposts, basically going from what was going to be selected pro bono cases over time, that's voluntary work, which could take many years, to now arguing maybe the firms have to service his administration as he goes. Negotiating trade deals, which, by the way, most people say is not how that really works and is not realistic, or defending his own chosen allies. It's all adding up really fast. There's a lot of concern, there's a lot of folding, and there's some high-level resistance. What is the right path, and how do you challenge these things when you know practically the Supreme Court can barely get its own recent order enforced?
Well, I think that the Trump administration is going so far on a number of fronts that they're forcing a confrontation, right? I mean, the courts can't simply roll over and let the government defy their orders. Harvard can't just roll over and accept $2 billion in cut funds and accept the government's demands, which were essentially a kind of takeover of the university. There are just some basic principles at stake, and judges are going to continue to care about the rule of law, and some of them will try to stand up for it. And universities care about academic freedom and being able to make their own decisions. And so I think the Trump administration is kind of forcing a test of these limits in a way that is creating more resistance from these really important parts of civil society than we've seen yet. And we'll see if the politics shifts, right? I mean, Trump seems to think that by keeping the focus on immigration or attacking an elite school, that that's a win for him politically. But when you go this far and you just deny people any chance for a hearing when you are snatching them up and scooting them off to a really brutal prison in another country, that may be a bridge too far for a lot of Americans.
Right, and it's certainly anti-conservative in the traditional sense, anti-American in that the due process and habeas rights are one of the fundamentals going all the way back to the Revolution. You mentioned the defiance is on purpose. When the ruling came down on Garcia and they said facilitate the return, in those breaking coverage first few minutes, I discussed with another lawyer, not unlike yourself, a legal expert, that a lot was going to come down to facilitate because this is not a normal administration that has acted in good faith. Now, if they wanted to just slow roll it, they could say, we'll see. Hey, we asked. They could say in public and then in private have other things going on. They're not doing that. They're not being coy or slow. I want to play for you what the Attorney General says.
He is not coming back to our country. President Bukele said he was not sending him back. That's the end of the story. If he wanted to send him back, we would give him a plane ride back. There was no situation ever where he was going to stay in this country. None.
He's not coming back is a long way from we tried or we want to facilitate. Even by what I call the crack in the door that Chief Justice Roberts left open, even by that standard, she's going further. Can the Supreme Court leave this as the result and then expect future more controversial or tougher case orders to be followed?
I mean, I don't see how they can do that, especially after this stirring opinion today from Judge Harvey Wilkinson, who is a deeply conservative Reagan appointee. He's 80 years old. He's respected throughout the federal judiciary. And he ended that opinion by saying, you know, it's not too late for the executive branch and the judicial branch to show each other the customary respect that our system depends on. So he is kind of imploring the government to change its stance. Now, I agree with you. We've seen no evidence of that from the government so far, but the stakes are really clear, and it's just hard to see how the judicial branch can let this one slide, given the level of defiance and also the kind of farcical nature of what Attorney General Pam Bondi is saying, right? I mean, this is not a decision that is up to the president of El Salvador. The United States of America is paying for the incarceration of Abrego Garcia in another country, but still he is there because of the United States, not because of El Salvador.
Does anything give you hope for the Supreme Court holding the line?
Well, I mean, the opinion they issued last week, while you're right, it had a crack in it or two, did say that the government has to treat this case as if Mr. Abrego Garcia had not been illegally deported to El Salvador, because the government admitted they did that by mistake, and so it's not legal. And I see the Supreme Court language where they say they say to the government, you're supposed to take steps to facilitate his return as going down the right path. That does give me some optimism about the Supreme Court continuing to uphold the rule of law here.
Garrett, what does the president mean exactly when he writes his termination can't come soon enough, talking about the Fed chair?
It's a tough question to answer, honestly, Anna. I think what we see here is someone who has been a foil for President Trump almost since the president appointed him during his first term. The President Trump has regularly speculated about firing Jerome Powell. He's complained about his unwillingness, in the president's view, to lower interest rates fast enough. And there you see in that Truth Social post kind of a passive voice speculation about firing Powell. Now, it's been sort of understood that it's not possible to fire the Fed chair before the end of his term, which in this particular case comes up in 2026. Up until now, if there's anyone who could within the executive branch, it would be the president, which makes his formulation of that post all the more curious. Normally, you would say that this is a position that cannot be fired within the federal government. That's certainly Powell's view of his position. But the president has already fired several other nominally independent regulators across the federal government, and the Supreme Court is looking into that question even as we speak. So, again, sort of a veiled threat of some kind from the president, but not a lot of specificity there.
Brian, tell us more, though, about the comments we heard from the Fed chair that has apparently really set the president off.
Yeah, well, I mean, he was saying that the tariff policies are going to throw the United States economy into definitely more uncertainty that at least they had planned for. So the Federal Reserve chairman telling the Economic Club of Chicago yesterday that the tariffs were larger than they had expected. And for that reason, they expect the U.S. economy to grow slower and for price pressures and for inflation to go higher as a result of these policies. Take a listen to the Fed chair yesterday.
Our obligation is to keep longer-term inflation expectations well anchored and to make certain that a one-time increase in the price level does not become an ongoing inflation problem. We may find ourselves in the challenging scenario in which our dual mandate goals are in tension. If that were to occur, we would consider how far the economy is from each goal and the potentially different time horizons over which those respective gaps would be anticipated to close.
I want to point out that that challenging scenario is one that the Federal Reserve has been in before during Trump's first term, during the trade war with China as well, where it was actually the ratcheting up of the tariff conversation that led the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates with the economic uncertainty, financial markets also roiling at the time. So maybe the similar playbook here, although I want to point out the Fed has been very adamant they do not make interest rate moves based off of, politics. But if the economy and the financial markets do react negatively, maybe that puts the Fed in an uncomfortable position to act. He quoted Ferris Bueller, actually, the Fed chair yesterday, saying life moves pretty fast, clearly tariff policy as well.
Well, and this is a Fed chair, Jeff, who has shown independence, even though he was appointed by President Trump, actually in his first term. Now he's repeatedly taken on some heat from the president, who's called for his resignation multiple times. The Fed chair, Jerome Powell, has said it's not permitted under law for him to be fired. So what do you make of this growing tension between these two?
Couple things. Number one, President Trump, as you rightly say, appointed Fed Chair Powell during his first term, passing over at the time Janet Yellen, who was the Fed chair and then ended up becoming President Biden's Treasury Secretary. President Biden reappointed him, and that may give President Trump another opportunity to blame Biden, which is something that he likes to do. In general, I would say my analysis is President Trump likes to have a foil, whether that is the Fed chair, whether that is the media, whether that is his predecessor. That's something that he likes very much. He needs to have something or someone to blame. And right now, he's got a lot of problems. And so he's looking for people to point the finger at.
As we've mentioned, Jason, we have seen this president get rid of IGs, FBI directors, people who traditionally would seem off limits. And so normally we would say he couldn't fire someone from an independent agency, full stop. But that question is currently before the Supreme Court right now, with a ruling expected at any time. What is your reaction, Jason, to the president's threat to now terminate Powell? Should we take it seriously?
I think we absolutely should take it seriously. First of all, let's understand what Powell did wrong. He stated the obvious. He said something that every economist is saying, which is these tariffs are going to cause higher inflation and higher unemployment. In his first term, there were two big constraints on firing Powell. The first was the fear of what the market reaction would be. The second was the constraint from the Supreme Court. Well, the president has shown that he cares much less about markets than he did in his first term. I don't know how much of a restraint that will be on him. And the court, is anyone's guess what they will decide in these other cases and the implications that would have for the president wielding, unlimited power over the executive branch, including the Federal Reserve.
You do have to wonder how long the president can just sort of brush off what we're seeing on Wall Street right now. Obviously, Wall Street was rattled by those comments from Jerome Powell yesterday. We saw the Dow close down 700 points, and right now it's on target to have another negative day. Right now, again, Jason, this appears to be reaction to the potential downturn of the economy. Do you agree with Powell's assessment of the tariff impact and the state of the economy?
Absolutely. I don't know an economist that doesn't think that we're going to get higher inflation and lower growth because of these tariffs. The debate is whether the growth is going to be like 0.03, so you don't have a recession, or minus something, which would be a recession. But you're just debating shades of badness. And for the Fed, this is particularly difficult. When the inflation rate rises, they like to raise interest rates to cool the economy down. When the unemployment rate rises, they like to cut interest rates to, help fix the economy. They can't do both of those. And so they don't have a good answer. The only good answer to the economic quandary we're in isn't the Fed solving a problem it can't solve. It would be the president dropping his insistence on these huge, destabilizing, harmful tariffs.
So let's talk to Garrett about that piece, because the president continues to meet with foreign leaders for tariff negotiations. Yesterday it was Japan. Today it's Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. Garrett, what should we expect from this meeting today?
Well, the Italian prime minister represents a far-right party in Italy. She's sort of culturally aligned with President Trump, seen to be one of the most conservative leaders in Western Europe. So there should be some positive vibes from this meeting. But Italy also has a significant trade surplus with the United States. The U.S. in a trade debt to Italy, which is not something the president would like. Nor really like the fact that Italy is a laggard when it comes to defense spending, and they're short of the NATO goal of 2% of their GDP. So some thorny issues to hash out with a leader who might otherwise be seen as something of a bridge between this president and the European Union. We will watch this all play out, as we've gotten used to seeing in an Oval Office meeting. The two are expected to have around 1 o'clock today, Anna.
Jeff?
In a previous life, I covered the European Union in Brussels. And I think it's important to note that the EU negotiates as a bloc on trade. So Meloni coming today is not just representing her country, Italy. She's representing 27 nations.
And she's been called Europe's Trump whisperer.
Ding, ding, ding. There's a reason why she's coming and not the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, who is not necessarily seen in Trump world as an interlocutor that they want to deal with. So it was pretty strategic of the EU to send the Italian Prime Minister.
I also wonder how much of the optics optics is sort of giving the president what he wants to begin with, that he can then claim, some kind of victory just by having the show of all these leaders coming to him and wanting to meet with him directly. I mean, he even tweeted about that this morning or put out a social media post. Do you think that that is the goal in some ways?
Oh, I think it's a big part of the goal. The optics matter a lot to this White House and to this president. He wants to see and he wants to show that leaders are coming, that leaders are calling, that leaders want to make a deal. He likes very much to be the deal maker in chief. And if he shows the world, if he shows his constituents that others are coming and I don't want to say bending the knee, but at least coming and doing what he wants, that's a win for President Trump.
The president, Brian, has said that these tariffs would be bringing in $2 billion a day of revenue to the U.S. government. But then there was some new data that just came out that really suggests that's not happening. What are the facts?
Yeah, and that's coming from his own CBP in a statement to CNBC saying that the real figure is actually somewhere closer to $500 million. That's well short of what the president has said of $2 billion per day. But I think what's even more important than the actual number itself is the kind of rhetorics around who's actually paying it. Because I want to point out that when it comes to these import fees, really it's an American importing company that in many cases is the one that has to fill out the forms to say, hey, here's the tariff that we need to pay, and then they pay CBP that fee. So it's not the CCP or the European Union that's paying those fees. It's American companies that are bringing those goods into the United States that are now facing that higher levy. This all kind of puts into this conversation what we need to remember, which is that ultimately these costs could get passed down to consumers. It's not the governments that really pay them. It is the American buyer that is going to face those price increases when those companies pass it on to them.
Yeah, we're continuing, of course, to follow the news out of Florida, where a shooting at Florida State University in Tallahassee has left at least 6 people injured and 1 person who has lost their lives. Joining us now, Fred Guttenberg. He's the father of Jamie Guttenberg, who was killed in the 2018 Marjorie Stoneman Douglas school shooting. Fred, you and I have spoken so many times, and so many of the times that we have spoken has been right after another horrible nightmare. And I'm just thinking, Fred, what on the February the 14th, Valentine's Day 2018, those 17 people that lost their lives, including your extraordinary daughter. The age would have been, had she been able to continue with her dreams and her aspirations and all that she would have contributed to all of us, very well would have been a possibility that she would be in a university setting in one way or another. Have you spoken to anybody at FSU? Do you know of anybody who's up there?
My daughter would be graduating this year from college. My daughter was friends with many people, as was my son, who are at FSU right now. My wife and I and my son have spent the past few hours on the phone with families, with parents and kids, checking in to make sure people are all right, because they were, in fact, there. I can tell you, Jose, I'm not talking about 1 or 2 people who are now a part of 2 school shootings in their lives. I am talking dozens of people who I know who are now a part of 2 school shootings in their lives. I know kids who I've spoken with this afternoon who were not only in the 1200 building in Parkland, but were in that student union today. And so I am, to say I've spent the afternoon kind of shaking would be an understatement.
Yeah.
Seeing the opening to this new segment with the current occupant of the White House, who was also the president when my daughter was killed, angers me beyond measure because of what he failed to do back then. It angers me beyond measure because for the past 30 days, he has been systematically undoing everything good that we did during the Biden years, the Office of Gun Violence Prevention, all the measures to implement BISCA, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, bipartisan legislation, all the executive actions. He has been systematically undoing every single one of them. And so if anyone is surprised that he will do nothing after today, you shouldn't be.
There is always the, thoughts and comments of people after something like this happens. And, we don't know, Fred, how many people have, we're saying 6 or so injured. We don't know what kind of injuries they have sustained. But Fred, talk, as I've asked you when we were speaking after Uvalde, and as you and I have spoken after so many of these tragedies, I ask you to do something that only you and a handful of others, unfortunately, it's a lot of people, but only you can do, which is to speak to the families of, in this case, the one person that has lost their lives. We don't know who that is, but speak to that family. Speak to those people who right now have their children in lockdown or are just terrified of what they witnessed or what they heard. And so I ask you, as I've asked you, unfortunately, so many times, Fred, speak to them.
And I hope it's only the one, which is already one too many. I've been doing everything I can to stay in touch with people up there. I fear that number is going to change. I was having a conversation yesterday with Chris Brown of Brady. And we were actually talking about the show The Pit, and which I watched. And there was a mass shooting scene within the show. And I remember saying to Chris yesterday, I remember sitting in the hospital with my wife on February 14, 2018, hoping and praying my daughter was being put back together, hoping and praying she survived gun violence from an AR-15. And I wasn't that lucky. And so my message to all these families who are in the hospital right now with your loved ones who are being taken care of in these trauma settings, just know that every effort that is possible will be taken to help them heal. Everybody who matters to you is going to be by your side. Everyone who you need in your life, this is a moment where we lean on our helpers. They hold us up. They keep us steady. Reach out to them. Let them reach out to you. I just want to tell these families, I love you. I can't believe that we're doing this again. This is uniquely American. Don't let anybody tell you that it's not. If people want to fully understand why I get so angry when I talk about this, it's not because I'm anti-gun. It's because I hate gun violence, and we can do something about gun violence. We've got to stop allowing those who should not have access to weapons to have that easy access to weapons. Jose, you're here in Florida. You know as well as I do, rather than spending the past few months doing everything possible to take the additional steps to reduce gun violence, here in the Florida legislature, they've been taking steps to make gun violence more possible. They want to roll back the law that we passed after Parkland. They tried to roll back the age of 21 that we passed. There are others that want to roll back the red flag laws. It's the stupidest, most insane behavior, but that's what's currently happening in the Florida legislature in Tallahassee, where this shooting just happened. I hope and I pray, yes, I have thoughts and prayers that every Republican who has been behind the effort to do that stands up today and says, I was wrong, that I want to respect gun rights. Every Republican should say that, but they should also say, I respect life. And I want to do everything possible to protect those we love from being the victims of the next mass shooting.
Fred, what does your son tell you today?
We've had one conversation since the news, and it was about the need to just reach out to everybody we know.
Yeah.
And So I will be reaching out to him again after this interview. I know that's what he's been doing this afternoon. My son has been very private and very quiet over this. But this brings up memories for him, and this brings up trauma for him that I just that I can't describe.
No.
You know.
Yeah. I got to tell you, man, Fred. You know, just the thought, and we began our conversation with this, that Jamie would have been graduating this year. You know, we're coming up on May in 5 minutes, and it's that graduation ceremony that you and your family aren't going to be able to have. It's the beginning of a new life of service, of making a difference, of continuing through dreams, hopes, and aspirations of good people that will not have the opportunity. And it just breaks my heart, man. And I just want to say thank you, Fred. I know how difficult this is in this time and in every time. And you were talking about healing, and I know that for all of you, healing is not truly possible. But the daily affirmations of hope, I thank you, Fred. I thank you, and just send my best to your family. And I appreciate always your willingness to come and speak with me and with us, even under the most difficult of circumstances. I appreciate that, my friend. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose.
The whole point of having due process in this country, and really any country, is so that you can find out what the truth is, right? There's lots of allegations against Kilmar Abrego Garcia. The Trump administration has called him a gang member, a terrorist, and a human trafficker. Those are serious things to say about someone. Yesterday, the DOJ released this trove of documents intending to show that the man is an MS-13 gang member, including something called a gang field interview sheet that was put together in 2019 from the Prince George's County Police Department of Maryland. The report alleges that during a 2019 interview with police, Abrego Garcia was wearing a Chicago Bulls hat and a hoodie with rolls of money covering the eyes, ears, and mouth of the presidents on the separate denominations. Officers know such clothing to be indicative of Hispanic gang culture. The report also says officers spoke to a, quote, reliable source of information who advised Abrego Garcia is an active member of MS-13. Today, the Prince George's County Police Department released a statement confirming that Abrego Garcia was never charged with a crime. They also confirmed that one of the officers who put together that gang field interview sheet pleaded guilty to misconduct in office in an unrelated case and was fired in 2022. Now, Abrego Garcia's lawyers and family say he is not a gang member, and we know that he has no criminal record. But of course, none of these allegations, right, against Abrego Garcia are definitive one way or the other. The whole point of hundreds of years of legal tradition we are inheritors to is that there is a process to establish these contested facts. They could have just held an immigration hearing. As Judge J. Harvey Wilkinson, the legendary conservative Reagan appointee on the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, noted in a remarkable ruling today, one that thunders with righteous indignation from a jurist long admired on the right. Wilkinson writes, quote, "The government asserts that Abrego Garcia is a terrorist and a member of MS-13. Perhaps, perhaps not. Regardless, he is still entitled to due process. If the government is confident of its position, it should be assured that position will prevail in proceedings to terminate the withholding of removal order," right? That was the order that was in place to stop him from being deported to El Salvador. So, in other words, if you guys are so certain he's guilty, it should be easy to prove. In fact, the standard that would pertain here would be a preponderance of the evidence, not even beyond a reasonable doubt, right? That portion I read you was part of the larger decision today in which the Fourth Circuit rejected efforts by the Trump DOJ to short-circuit the lower court's order to facilitate Abrego Garcia's return from that prison in El Salvador. Judge Wilkinson also included a stark warning, quote, "It is difficult in some cases to get to the very heart of the matter, but in this case it is not hard at all. The government is asserting a right to stash away residents of this country in foreign prisons without the semblance of due process that is the foundation of our constitutional order. Further, it claims in essence that because it has rid itself of custody, that there is nothing that can be done. This should be shocking, not only to judges, but to the intuitive sense of liberty that Americans far removed from courthouses still hold dear. Ashra Agapa is a former FBI special agent, now an assistant dean of the Yale Jackson School of Global Affairs, and she joins me now. Good to have you here.
Thanks.
This was a 7-page, opinion order issued by the Fourth Circuit, authored by Wilkinson. It really sort of put me back in my chair.
Yeah, I think when he says it's very simple to get to the heart of the matter, there aren't many silver linings in this Abrego Garcia situation, but we do have the fact that we've gone from zero to Pinochet in 100 days. And it's pretty clear where we are. When I teach habeas corpus in my national security law class, I use as sort of the hyperbolic example, habeas corpus is what stands between you and the president grabbing you in the middle of the night and throwing you into a foreign gulag. And that's not hyperbolic anymore. That is what is happening. It's such a foundational right that it is the right that is expressly forbidden from being suspended in the Constitution. And it's in Article 1 because the framers knew that if you gave that power to the president, you might have a lot of invasions and rebellions to justify it. So the fact that this is happening, that the Trump administration has washed its hands of Abrego Garcia.
President Trump and his MAGA acolytes are escalating their attacks on American universities, and they are trying to make an example out of Harvard. Today, Department of Homeland Security demanded that the university's records of foreign students, and they demanded to see them, and then they threatened to revoke Harvard's ability to host those very students. The House Oversight Committee launched an investigation into the university, and in a very disturbing example of the executive branch influence over taxation, the Internal Revenue Service is making plans to rescind Harvard's tax-exempt status on orders from the president himself, as stop work orders are now rolling in for Harvard's researchers after a $2.2 billion pause in federal funds. And this is all because the university refused demands to make sweeping changes to its policies, which included requirements to audit the viewpoints of the student body, faculty, and staff. This is just the tip of the spear, folks. Semaphore was first to report the next phase of the administration's pressure campaign on universities, which will include putting their endowments under a microscope. Back with me is Janae Nelson, President and Director Counsel of the Legal Defense Fund. Janae, first of all, kudos to Harvard for standing up, because so many large organizations, schools, and law firms have bent the knee and acquiesced in this moment. I want to play for you what Caroline Levitt had to say about this very issue on Harvard from the White House press briefing.
All the president is asking, don't break federal law, and then you can have your federal funding. I think the president is also begging a good question. More than $2 billion out the door to Harvard when they have a more than $50 billion endowment. Why are the American taxpayers subsidizing a university that has billions of dollars in the bank already? And we certainly should not be funding a place where such grave anti-Semitism exists.
Janae, my read from it is what the president is doing and the White House is attempting to do is illegal. Is this all not illegal?
It's absolutely illegal. And I want to be really, really clear. To shroud this as some sort of protection against anti-Semitism is actually offensive. The Legal Defense Fund stands firmly against anti-Semitism, against Islamophobia, against violence for any students and intimidation. That's very clear. That's not what this is about. And many Jewish groups have made it very clear that they do not want their names used as an excuse to break the law, as we see here. This is one of our nation's most revered educational institutions as part of the American university system, which is, revered around the world. And what this administration is attempting to do is to break one of the biggest universities, one of the most renowned, in order to make every other university and institution heel to this administration. And the ultimate goal is to make it so that there cannot be a diversity of viewpoints, there won't be a diversity of students, there won't be unfettered freedom of speech and expression on university campuses, because he doesn't like some of the ideas that are being taught in universities across the country. Because he doesn't like it doesn't mean that it is unlawful and that he can weaponize the government's power to try to harm universities that he doesn't get along with or that he doesn't like. And so I'm very, very proud of Harvard for standing up against these attempts to abuse authority even further. And they are not alone. Stanford and Yale and other universities have stood with Harvard. And it's what we're also seeing in the legal profession. This is just the same playbook that he tried with certain law firms who did capitulate, and then others who are backing up and saying, we are not going to be bullied by this administration. That's why the Legal Defense Fund was so proud to file an amicus brief in support of the law firms that are standing up and standing back, because we suffered similar consequences when we were fighting for civil rights in the 60s, when we were trying to end legal apartheid in this country. The reason that we can sit here today in an integrated society is because we stood up to the offensive tactics from states and governments that tried to make us back down. And so we're urging every institution in this country not to back down to this administration, because we know what we're doing is right. We know what universities are doing is right. And we know that to back up a bully, you've got to look them dead in the eye and say, I'm not turning back.
Honestly, if you give a bully your lunch money on Monday, they're coming back Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then next Monday again to get it. There are people that I think have been emboldened by the fact that there are institutions pushing back against the president and the White House. U.S. universities faculty unite to defend academic freedom after Trump's attacks. Indiana University is leading the push for a pact among 18 institutions as Trump targets diversity. And then you have Northwestern University. In February of 2025, Northwestern's library's website removed DEI mentions as the university responded to that executive order from Donald Trump. And then on April 10th, Donald Trump's administration froze $1.8 billion for Northwestern as well as Cornell. They say, on one hand, they say this is about anti-Semitism. I agree. I think this is them using anti-Semitism as a cloak for their very nefarious activities, and it is offensive. And if they really want to stand up to anti-Semitism, I think maybe they should check on the governor of Pennsylvania that also happens to be Jewish that had a bomb, like a firebomb thrown through his house the other night. Yeah. Might want to check on that.